Hi, I'm Priscilla Wegars. I'm the founder and volunteer curator of the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection, and I'm also the founder of the Kooskia Internment Camp project. Today we're going to have an introduction to the Kooskia, Idaho World War II Japanese internment camp that was in operation from May 1943 to May 1945. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt immediately issued 3 presidential proclamations. These authorized the FBI to arrest and detain Japanese, German, and Italian aliens on no specific grounds and without the due process guaranteed to them by the U.S. Constitution. Those rounded up included several thousand Japanese, mostly men. The FBI took them to jail, often without telling their families where they were going or what was happening to them. For the Japanese in particular, this was clearly an early example of racial profiling, although the term was not used then. The U.S. government interned first Japanese non-citizens and later imprisoned Japanese American citizens and other Japanese non-citizens because they looked like the Japanese enemy and therefore might commit sabotage. Prominent non-citizens, such as priests, ministers, language teachers, newspaper editors, Japanese community organization officials, and other leaders were the first to be arrested. Some of them had lived in the U.S. for over 40 years. At the time, racist U.S. laws would not let people born in Japan, China, or other Asian countries become naturalized citizens. For example, Reverend Hozen Seki, a Buddhist minister from New York City, could not disassociate himself from untrue accusations of disloyalty. After a few weeks, which included a kangaroo court type of hearing where they could not be represented by a lawyer, they were removed to Department of Justice internment camps run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service at Fort Missoula in Montana, Fort Lincoln at Bismarck in North Dakota, and later to other internment camps in Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. Another INS camp in north central Idaho was the Kooskia Internment Camp. Over time, terminology has evolved to describe the difference between the War Relocation Authority camps for Japanese American families and the Department of Justice camps for non-citizens, mostly men. People often call the WRA camps internment camps, but that is not accurate. The Japanese Americans in them were mostly not aliens who were interned, they were U.S. citizens who were incarcerated, and the WRA camps were actually prisons, incarceration camps, or even concentration camps. The real internment camps were run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service for the Justice Department. They housed Japanese, German, and Italian aliens who were arrested shortly after Pearl Harbor. Therefore, internment camp is best used only for the Justice Department camps, and the WRA camps are incarceration camps or concentration camps. Research for the Kooskia Internment Camp project involved photographs, newspapers, National Archives records, and interviews with 2 surviving Kooskia internees and 2 former employees, all of whom have since died, and with living descendants of other deceased internees and employees. For example, every Kooskia internee had a basic personnel record card, now at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Here, this card is for Reverend Hozen Seki, the Buddhist minister from New York City. The backside of the BPR card included the man's address, occupation, next of kin, and other personal information. Other records involve Kooskia internees from outside the U.S. During World War II, Peru and some other Latin American countries colluded with the U.S. to kidnap and expel persons of Japanese ancestry for possible exchange with U.S. citizens who were stranded in Japan when World War II began. In 1942 and 1943, American ships brought them to the U.S. where they were interned in various places. 27 Japanese Peruvians were interned in the Kooskia camp. One was Arturo Yokabe, the youngest Kooskia internee. Although he was born in Peru, he was arrested after his Japanese-born employer bribed officials to take Yokabe instead. The Kooskia Internment Camp was at the confluence of Canyon Creek and the Lochsa River at Milepost 104 on what is now Highway 12 between Lewiston, Idaho and Missoula, Montana. The area, which was probably first used as a campground by Native Americans, is still considered part of Nez Perce ancestral territory. From mid-June to mid-October 1933, the site housed the Civilian Conservation Corps' CCC Camp F-38. They were working on road building and firefighting for the Forest Service. Beginning in August 1935 until it closed in early May 1943, the site next held Federal Prison Camp No. 11, a work camp for convicts from Leavenworth, Kansas. They helped improve and construct the Lewis-and-Clark Highway, now Highway 12. Almost immediately after closing, the federal prison camp became the Kooskia Internment Camp. The buildings and facilities included an administration building with lodging for single officers, a laundry, powerhouse, and repair garage, a kitchen and mess hall, a dormitory with 4 wings that could house 60 men each, a central bathroom block, and a crafts building. Some 265 Japanese internees lived at the Kooskia Internment Camp during the 2 years that it was open, but not all at the same time. Like the federal prison camp, the Kooskia Internment Camp had about 24 Euro-American employees, including 3 women. The married prison camp employees lived in cottages at Apgar Creek, a half-mile away. On the morning of May 27, 1943, a curious crowd assembled at the Lewiston, Idaho Union Pacific train depot. They had come to observe the arrival of a train carrying 104 Japanese from the Santa Fe, New Mexico internment camp. The Japanese on the train were taken up the Clearwater River to the INS's Kooskia Internment Camp, 30 miles away. Shortly after their arrival at the Kooskia camp, the internees began writing to friends and relatives. A censor read all their outgoing mail, even very personal letters, and deleted any forbidden statements. The men's first impressions related mostly to the scenic surroundings, their accommodations, the food, and the potential for recreational activities. If you look closely, you can see 5 men atop this rock pinnacle. Yoshito Kadotani from California wrote, "Freshness of the air is unsurpassed. Of course, there isn't that unpleasant fence. Really, it's a paradise in mountains. It reminds me so much of Yosemite National Park." Internee Hisahiko Teraoka from Mexico wrote about the accommodations. He enjoyed the many windows which give us plenty of light and ventilation. Here, 2 men are playing the Japanese strategy game called Go, and 3 other men are watching them. Teraoka also praised the food quite highly, writing, "The food is extra good, and every day we get something new from the oven. Everything tastes mighty good." However, another man was not so pleased. He wrote, "But foods is not so good, so we are floored." That part was censored out of his letter. Over time, the internees were able to get more Japanese-style meals, and as the food improved, so did their opinion of it.
Prisoners consume food and drink using ceramics issued by the United States government, such as these plain white bowls, known as institutional wares, found at the Kooskia Internment Camp during excavations. A few non-government issued ceramics were excavated, however, including this porcelain fragment made in Japan for Japanese nationals and this fiestaware plate made in California.
The internees began working on June 1, 1943. That evening, Ed Yoshimura from California wrote to some relatives who were incarcerated at the Poston WRA camp. "This was the first day on my new job since we came out here, and it's not merely a job, but a real he-man's job. I drive a dumping truck, and you ought to see the size of the truck. A great big monster as big as locomotive and as husky as war tank, and I am not exaggerating either. Now I know that I am going to be a regular roughneck. We are a sort of selected group, volunteered to get out of the wired fence and work, so that we allow no chiselers and strictly cooperative. We are much happier now, and that's exactly how I wanted to get by in the circumstances we are in." The Kooskia internees were all volunteers from other Justice Department internment camps. Road workers received $55 or $65 per month with a $10 deduction for special clothing, while camp workers in the kitchen, laundry, and so on only received 80 cents per day. Consequently, there were few volunteers for camp work. The first group of 104 internees solved the camp operation problem. They supplied 25 men for the required support jobs and distributed all the income equally among the entire group. One Japanese internee was the timekeeper. He kept track of the hours the men worked so they would get paid the correct amount. Euro-American employees of the U.S. Bureau of Public Roads supervised the workers. Milt Barton, the power shovel operator, was impressed with the attitude and work ethic of the Japanese. Though lacking in highway construction skills, they were fast learners and demonstrated very little animosity as a result of being interned. Some of the internees cut trees or cleared brush and debris from new portions of the road or removed rock slides off the road. Other men operated jackhammers, drove the dump trucks, and ran specialized equipment. The internees also helped with the blasting, even though they were not supposed to handle explosives. The internees' treatment was governed by the Geneva Convention, a 1929 international agreement specifying how prisoners of war should be treated. Although the Kooskia and other internees were not prisoners of war, the enemy nations agreed that the Geneva Convention could apply to internees also, and it thus gave them certain rights and privileges. Although initially pleased with their circumstances, the internees soon found that all was not as had been promised. The men particularly disliked Superintendent Reamer's way of treating them as prisoners, not as internees. Because of censorship, they could not communicate their dissatisfaction to the outside world. For example, in early July 1943, Tommy Yoshito Kadotani wrote, "As a result of recent shift of officers, majority of them has been changed, but it has been decided that Superintendent Reamer will remain in office. This fellow is not in the least cooperative and does not give us convenience, so we are all really disappointed, and some of us is insisting to change our residences." This typed copy of a censored letter is now in the National Archives. The underlined statements are the ones that the censor cut out or blacked out of the original letter before mailing it to the recipient. Empowered by the Geneva Convention, the disgruntled internees prepared a lengthy petition detailing their complaints and submitted it to Bert Fraser, the officer in charge at the Fort Missoula internment camp. If conditions did not improve, they all wanted to transfer up there. The next few months saw many other changes and improvements at the Kooskia camp in response to their petition. In mid-November 1943, morale was helped considerably when Merrill Scott became the new superintendent. One official visitor commented, "Mr. Scott seems to know every internee by name, has direct and personal contacts with all of them, and they hold him in highest respect and esteem." One of the internees' main demands was for better medical treatment. This man, Tsuneyoshi Koba, was an internee at Fort Missoula. He convinced the authorities that he was a medical doctor, so they sent him to the Kooskia camp. Unfortunately, he had faked his credentials. Once he was exposed as a quack with 12 aliases, he was sent back to Fort Missoula. The Kooskia camp's next doctor was an Italian internee physician, Ludwig Borovica. After Italy surrendered in September 1943, Borovica was released the following February. A German internee doctor, Hans-Werner Kempski, replaced Borovica. He stayed until the Kooskia camp closed. Besides doctoring the internees, he treated many camp employees and their family members. The Kooskia camp dentists worked under the doctor's supervision. Hiromi Tojo did fillings and extractions, and Keiji Kijima manufactured false teeth. In 2010, during excavations at the Kooskia Internment Camp, the archaeologists found a denture mold and several examples of false teeth that he had made.
Archaeologists have also found a Japanese-manufactured toothbrush and toothpaste at the site. This same toothbrush in the slide has also been found in archaeological excavations at Southern California's Terminal Island, where a Japanese-American community lived prior to World War II. Some of the men who were imprisoned at Kooskia called Terminal Island home before being imprisoned.
With Sundays off and free time after dinner, the internees had sufficient leisure to engage in a wide variety of recreational pursuits. For example, this oil painting of the camp was painted by the Japanese man who was the timekeeper. He gave it to Amelia Jacks, a Kooskia camp office employee. Other men tended animals, built things such as this small chest for DeAnn Jacks, the daughter of 2 employees, attended classes, played musical instruments, participated in Japanese dance and drama, and attended movies. This blackboard lists the coming films in both English and Japanese. Other men gathered wild foods such as edible ferns and mushrooms, gardened, listened to the radio, read books and magazines, and wrote letters to friends and family members. One internee made this elaborately embroidered pillow cover and gave it to bulldozer operator Bill Meisner. Meisner's son Mike commented on the irony of an internee making this patriotic statement. Other internees collected colored stones for craft projects, as they had done at Fort Missoula and elsewhere.
To pass the time, prisoners made additional types of artwork, like this animal carved into stone that was found during excavations at Kooskia.
The internees had a canteen across Canyon Creek from the main camp area. It served beer and sold cigarettes, gum, and candy, as well as clothing.
These chocolate candy bar wrappers were recovered during archaeological excavations at Kooskia. They were studied by Shea Henry, an archaeologist who graduated from the University of Idaho's MA program in anthropology. Chocolate was marketed as a way of increasing male vitality during the war. The candy bars were made by Imperial Candy Company in Seattle, Washington in the early 1900s.
The canteen also sold fishing licenses and fishing tackle. The men were allowed to fish downstream unsupervised and built boats and rafts for that purpose. Since the name of one boat is Lima, its builder was most likely a Japanese-Peruvian internee. Some of the men played softball and handball. They also played ping pong and tennis, went swimming under supervision, took walks, and played Japanese games. Some people have commented that the internees seem to have had a pretty easy life at the Kooskia Internment Camp. What those people are forgetting is that these men were there simply because they were Japanese aliens. Most of them were aliens because racist U.S. laws would not allow them to become citizens. They had never committed any crimes and were not accused of any. Just because they were Japanese, the U.S. government imprisoned them because they looked like the enemy and thus might commit sabotage, even though some of them had sons who fought in the U.S. Army. As a result, they lost their businesses and homes and were separated from their families. Reverend Hozen Seki kept a diary in English for the second year that he was at the Kooskia camp. In it, he discusses how the internees could vote every 3 months for a council to represent them with the administration. The internee spokesman headed the council, and the camp administration provided him with an office. Paul Shoichi Kashino from Seattle was a Kibe, meaning a Japanese American who was educated in Japan. He was employed at Fort Missoula as an interpreter, translator, and mail censor. After Fort Missoula closed in July 1944, Kashino transferred to the Kooskia Internment Camp. In October 1944, he got married, and the couple's first home together was at the Kooskia camp in the employees' housing at Apgar Creek. Hozen Seki wrote about them in his diary. Mr. Kashino arrived with his new wife, who is lovely. He looks so happy. At New Year's, the internees gathered for a special Japanese custom. They pounded cooked sticky rice to make into a traditional New Year treat called mochi. They also decorated the mess hall, had a special meal, and sent New Year's cards to their friends and relatives. The internees could even have visitors. In April 1945, Reverend Hozen Seki's wife and 2 young children visited him all the way from New York City. The whole family was allowed to stay together in a vacant cottage in the employee housing area at Apgar, and the children teased their parents about the visit being like a honeymoon. The Kooskia camp closed in May 1945, and the internees were taken to the Santa Fe, New Mexico internment camp. There were 2 main reasons for closing the camp. First, enough internees had been released so that there were not sufficient men to do the work. Second, during wartime, it was difficult to get parts to repair the machinery. Eventually, the buildings at the camp and at Apgar were all removed. The Kooskia Internment Camp was a successful experiment in using Japanese non-citizen internees as road builders for a portion of the Lewis-Clark Highway between Idaho and Montana. Besides helping a much-needed road progress toward completion, the project enabled the unfairly incarcerated internees to regain much of the self-respect that many of them must have lost through the humiliation of having been so unjustly interned. Although Canyon Creek still gushes into the Lochsa River, today almost nothing else remains to remind us of what was once there. The National Park Service's Confinement Sites Grant Program funded 2 archaeological excavations at the Kooskia Internment Camp site, directed by Dr. Stacy Camp. The first was in 2010, and the second was in 2013. It has also funded laboratory research on artifacts found at the site and has recently funded a new digital platform where archaeological and archival data from the Kooskia Internment Camp and Minidoka National Historic Site can be shared with the public. Currently, there is no interpretive sign for the Kooskia Internment Camp site, but the Forest Service hopes to erect one eventually. The site also needs a nomination to the National Register of Historic Places, another Forest Service responsibility. The archaeological excavations and public presentations will serve as continuing reminders of the Kooskia Internment Camp, its internees and employees, and their contributions to American history in hopes that similar events will never happen again. Most of the materials generated by this project will eventually be housed in the Asian American Comparative Collection at the University of Idaho, Moscow. A photograph album that belonged to Wegars is now in the University of Idaho Library and has been scanned for online viewing. The grant-funded documentary research led to the publication of 2 books. The first was Imprisoned in Paradise, Japanese Internee Road Workers at the World War II Kooskia Internment Camp in 2010. The second was As Rugged as the Terrain, CCC Boys, Federal Convicts, and World War II Alien Internees Wrestle with a Mountain Wilderness. Published in 2013, it was the co-winner of the Idaho Library Association's Book of the Year.
If you'd like to learn more about the artifacts found at the Kooskia Internment Camp, we will be giving 2 Curator's Corner talks for the virtual pilgrimage. The first talk will be on the alcohol-related artifacts found at the site. The second talk will look at artifacts pertaining to the everyday lives of Kooskia's prisoners. If you'd like to see additional artifacts from the site, you can visit www.internmentarchaeology.org.